Most people think wealthy families stay rich because they simply earn more money. But here's the truth. Making money and preserving wealth are two completely different skills. And the secret weapon the wealthy use? Trusts. Now, when you hear trust fund, you probably picture spoiled rich kids living lavishly. But that's not the real story. Trusts were created for protection, control, and survival of wealth long after the original owner is gone. The real reason many wealthy families remain rich for generations is because they build systems around their wealth. They understand something the average person often ignores. Making money and preserving wealth are two completely different skills. And one of the most powerful systems wealthy families use to preserve wealth across generations is something called a trust. In reality, trusts were never originally designed for laziness or luxury. They were created for protection, control, structure, and survival of wealth long after the original owner is gone. You see, wealthy people understand a painful truth about money. Sometimes the biggest threat to an empire is not competitors, governments, or the economy. Sometimes it's the family itself. History is filled with examples of families destroying fortunes within 1 or 2 generations because there were no systems controlling the wealth. One generation works hard to build the empire. The next generation enjoys it. Then eventually, poor financial discipline, greed, family conflicts, lawsuits, reckless spending, divorces, addiction, and entitlements slowly destroy everything that was built. Wealthy people know something painful. The biggest threat to an empire isn't always competitors, governments, or the economy. Sometimes it's the family itself. History is full of fortunes destroyed in just 1 or 2 generations. Reckless spending, divorces, lawsuits, addiction, entitlement. That's why trusts become essential. A trust is not just about money. It is about creating rules, structures, and systems around wealth. Once wealth enters a trust, the money no longer moves freely like personal spending money. Instead, it moves according to predetermined conditions created by the original wealth builder. In simple terms, the wealthy stop treating wealth like personal property and start treating it like an institution. For example, a wealthy parent may place millions of dollars, businesses, real estate properties, stocks, or investments into a trust and establish specific rules such as children only receive income after a certain age, beneficiaries must complete college, family members cannot sell certain assets, funds can only be used for education, healthcare, or business investments, spending limits may exist, approval may be required before large withdrawals. This changes everything. Instead of money being controlled emotionally, it becomes controlled structurally. How trusts work. One of the most powerful things about trust funds is that they do more than protect money. They control behavior. In fact, one of the real purposes of a trust is to maintain discipline inside a family long after the original wealth creator is gone. Because wealthy families understand something deeply important. If human behavior is not controlled, wealth usually disappears. Imagine knowing your family has $1 billion fortune, but you cannot simply spend it any way you want. You cannot wake up and decide to buy 10 luxury cars, throw extravagant parties every weekend, gamble recklessly, or waste millions chasing temporary pleasures. The money exists, but access to it is controlled by systems, rules, and structures created years earlier by the founder of the family wealth. That changes the psychology of money completely. Many trusts are intentionally designed to fund productive behavior while restricting destructive behavior. For example, the trust may fully pay for education, healthcare, business creation, housing, investments, professional development, but it may refuse to fund drug addiction, reckless luxury spending, gambling, endless partying, wasteful consumerism, financial irresponsibility. In other words, the trust becomes a silent authority figure, enforcing discipline even after the founder is gone. A trust isn't just about money, it's about rules, structure, and discipline. Once wealth enters a trust, it stops behaving like personal property, it starts behaving like an institution. Imagine the basic structure of a trust fund created by Mr. Johnson. Decades ago, Mr. Johnson built a highly successful business empire through years of sacrifice, discipline, and strategic decision-making. But instead of leaving his fortune exposed to future family conflicts, reckless spending, or poor financial decisions after his death, he transferred his assets into a carefully designed trust governed by strict conditions and long-term rules. Rule 1. Children only receive income after a certain age. When his son David turned 21, he expected a big payout. Instead, the trustee told him, "Your income begins at 25. Until then, the trust only covers essentials like tuition and healthcare." David had to wait, teaching him patience and responsibility. Even after turning 25, David couldn't just withdraw millions at once. The trust capped his annual allowance, ensuring he learned to budget instead of burning through wealth. Years later, David wanted to buy a commercial property. He had to present his case to the trustees, showing how it fit the family's long-term vision. Only then was the money released. Rule 2. Beneficiaries must complete college. His daughter Sarah dreamed of dropping out to travel the world. But the trust had a condition: no degree, no access. That rule pushed her to finish college, and later she used trust funds to launch her own business. Rule 3. Funds can only be used for education, healthcare, or business investments. When David wanted to buy a flashy sports car, the trustee declined. But when Sarah presented a solid business plan, the trust released funds to help her start a tech company. This set a clear image that the money wasn't for luxury, it was for growth. Suddenly, the Johnson fortune wasn't controlled emotionally, it was controlled structurally. The trust acted like a silent guardian, rewarding discipline and blocking reckless behavior. David learned patience, Sarah learned responsibility, and the Johnson wealth didn't just survive, it grew. That's the power of a trust. It doesn't just pass down money, it passes down values, discipline, and systems. Children only receive income after a certain age. Beneficiaries must complete college. Funds can only be used for education, healthcare, or business investments. Spending limits exist. Large withdrawals require approval. Suddenly, money isn't controlled emotionally, it's controlled structurally. Wealth as an institution, and this is where the average person and wealthy families think very differently. Once trusts, foundations, holding companies, estate plans, tax structures, and family offices enter the picture, rich families stop functioning like simple households and start functioning more like corporations. Decisions move through layers of structure, approvals, legal oversight, and long-term planning. Money becomes less about personal consumption and more about preserving the family legacy. This is one reason many wealthy families remain powerful for decades or even centuries. The system survives even when individual family members are financially irresponsible. The structure itself becomes stronger than any one person, and psychologically, this changes how future generations think about wealth. Children raised around trusts often grow up understanding that wealth is not just for spending. It is something to manage, protect, grow, and transfer responsibly. They are taught stewardship instead of consumption. The family wealth begins behaving like an entity with rules, responsibilities, and governance. That's why wealthy families often focus heavily on estate planning, tax efficiency, asset protection, governance systems, family constitutions, business continuity, financial education for heirs. If wealth is not organized properly, it usually disappears. Many people focus only on earning income for today. Wealthy families think about protecting assets for grandchildren and great-grandchildren they may never even meet. That is generational wealth. It is not just about becoming rich. It is about building systems that allow wealth to outlive the original creator. Because real wealth is not measured by how much money someone spends while alive. Real wealth is measured by how long the money survives after they are gone. Wealthy families operate differently. Average families treat money emotionally. Wealthy families treat it organizationally. With trusts, foundations, estate plans, tax structures, and family offices, they stop functioning like households and start functioning like corporations. Decisions move through trustees, advisors, and governance boards. Money becomes less about consumption and more about preserving legacy. The bigger lesson. One important misconception about trusts is that many people believe they are only for billionaires, celebrities, or ultra-wealthy families. But in reality, trusts are not reserved only for the rich. At their core, trusts are simply tools for protection, structure, and long-term planning. Even middle-class families use them to organize assets, reduce conflict, and create clearer financial direction for future generations. You do not need private jets, mansions, or a billion-dollar estate before structure becomes important. In fact, many ordinary families experience major financial problems after the death of a parent or business owner because there was no organized system in place. Assets become tied up in disputes, properties get sold carelessly, businesses collapse, and family relationships become strained over money issues. A trust can help reduce that chaos by creating clear instructions ahead of time. For example, a parent with a modest house, some investments, a small business, life insurance, or retirement savings may want those assets managed responsibly for their children. Instead of leaving everything vulnerable to emotional decisions, they can establish guidelines for how resources are used over time. This becomes especially important when young children, financially inexperienced heirs, or family businesses are involved. And beyond wealth protection, trusts can also reflect values. A family may decide they want future generations to prioritize education, entrepreneurship, healthcare, or long-term stability instead of reckless consumption. The structure becomes a way of communicating principles even after the original creator is no longer present. This is why trusts are less about how much money someone has and more about how intentionally they want their assets managed. A person earning an average income can still think long-term. They can still create systems that reduce confusion, encourage responsibility, and help future generations avoid preventable financial mistakes. In many ways, trusts represent a shift in mindset. Instead of thinking only about immediate spending or short-term survival, people begin thinking about continuity, stability, and legacy. The conversation changes from, how much money do I have today, to, how do I organize what I build so it continues serving the people I care about in the future? And that way of thinking is not exclusive to wealthy families. It is available to anyone willing to think beyond the present moment. And here's the kicker. Trusts aren't just for billionaires. Even middle-class families use them to protect assets, reduce conflict, and pass down values. Because real wealth isn't measured by how much you spend while alive. It's measured by how long it survives after you're gone. If you only transfer money, it may disappear. But if you transfer values, discipline, and systems alongside the money, it has a much greater chance of surviving for generations. The dark side of trusts. But here's the twist. Trusts aren't perfect. A powerful and sophisticated as it may sound, they also come with serious downsides that many people rarely talk about. Because while trusts can preserve wealth and enforce discipline, they can also create emotional, psychological, and family-related problems if not designed carefully. The biggest dangers of trust funds is that they can sometimes produce dependence instead of ambition. When future generations grow up knowing there will always be money available, some lose the hunger to build, struggle, take risks, or develop resilience. The motivation that helped the original wealth creator succeed may slowly disappear in later generations because survival is no longer forcing discipline naturally. This is one reason people often say the first generation builds the wealth, the second maintains it, and the third destroys it. And history has repeatedly shown this pattern. A well-known example is the Vanderbilt family in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt built one of the greatest fortunes in American history during the 19th century through railroads and shipping. At the time of his death, his wealth was enormous, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. But over generations, much of the family fortune disappeared. Why? Because later generations became heavily associated with extravagant lifestyles, luxury spending, massive mansions, social status competition, and consumption rather than wealth creation itself. The discipline that built the empire became weaker over time. And that is one of the psychological risks of inherited wealth. People who did not experience the struggle of building money may not emotionally value it the same way. Trust funds can also create emotional resentment within families. Imagine siblings receiving unequal access to funds because trustees believe one child is more responsible than another. Imagine adults in their 40s or 50s still needing approval from trustees before accessing certain assets. Some beneficiaries begin feeling controlled, monitored, or restricted by systems created decades earlier. Instead of creating unity, the structure can sometimes create tension, power struggles, and deep family conflict. Another downside is that trusts can unintentionally limit creativity and independence. A person who knows their education, housing, and financial security are permanently guaranteed may become overly comfortable. Some heirs avoid entrepreneurship, difficult careers, or personal growth because the system already protects them from failure. Ironically, the same structure designed to preserve wealth can sometimes weaken the personal drive that creates greatness. There's also the issue of complexity and cost. Properly maintaining trusts often requires lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, trustees, tax planning, and continuous legal management. Poorly designed trusts can create confusion, legal battles, or unintended consequences that last for years. And perhaps the deepest downside is philosophical. Sometimes wealth becomes so controlled and systemized that family relationships begin feeling transactional rather than emotional. Family members may start viewing one another through the lens of access, inheritance, approvals, and financial influence instead of genuine connection. So while trust funds can preserve wealth remarkably well, they are not perfect systems. They solve certain problems while creating others. Because ultimately, no legal structure can fully replace strong character, values, personal responsibility, and healthy family culture. At the end of the day, money can be protected by systems, but human behavior will always remain the greatest challenge in preserving generational wealth. And interestingly, even trust structures themselves cannot completely eliminate this problem. Because once people know wealth exists behind a system of rules, many simply learn how to satisfy the conditions long enough to access the money. They become patient enough to beat the system. They follow the requirements, meet the expectations on paper, and wait for control to eventually transfer into their hands. But once access is granted, the discipline often disappears, and lavish living begins. This is why preserving wealth across generations is far more complicated than simply protecting money legally. A trust can control access, but it cannot automatically create wisdom, ambition, restraint, or strong character. So the next time you hear the words trust fund, don't just picture luxury cars, private jets, or spoiled heirs living extravagant lifestyles. Think deeper than that. Think about legacy. Think about structure. Think about long-term survival. Because for many wealthy families, trust funds are not really about showing off wealth. They are about protecting it from human weakness. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson here. Real generational wealth is not simply about leaving money behind. It's about passing down values, discipline, financial intelligence, responsibility, and systems strong enough to guide future generations long after the original creator is gone. Because wealth that is not organized eventually becomes vulnerable to poor decisions, internal conflicts, and short-term thinking. The goal is to create responsible stewards capable of protecting the family legacy for decades, sometimes centuries. And honestly, this conversation goes far beyond billionaires. Even ordinary families can learn something powerful from this mindset. If you build anything valuable in life, whether it's money, a business, property, or knowledge, you should think carefully about how it survives after you are gone. Because true wealth is not measured by how much money someone spends while alive. True wealth is measured by how long the value of what they built continues impacting future generations. So what do you think? Do trust funds preserve wealth, or do they sometimes weaken ambition and personal drive? Would you place strict conditions on your family inheritance, or would you allow complete freedom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective on this. And if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the Street Smart Secrets channel, and turn on notifications for more deep conversations about wealth, money psychology, generational wealth, financial systems, and how the rich think differently about money. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.